The great house of Ashworth Hall rose from the Devonshire hills like a gilded fortress against the autumn sky, its windows catching the last amber light of day. Carriages lined the gravel drive in an elegant procession, depositing silk-clad ladies and gentlemen in worsted wool upon the marble steps, where footmen in powdered wigs stood at attention. Eleanor Vane stepped down from her modest hired coach and felt the weight of 100 unspoken judgments press upon her shoulders. She was 37. A widow of 6 years, the mother of a son who had just gone up to Cambridge. In the eyes of the ton, these facts rendered her invisible, a piece of furniture draped in respectable lavender crepe, useful for chaperoning but otherwise beneath notice. Lady Vane. The butler's announcement fell into the chattering ballroom like a pebble into a still pond. A few heads turned. Most did not. Eleanor lifted her chin. The amethyst silk of her gown was not the latest fashion, but it suited her coloring, and the silver threading at her sleeves had been her own design. She had learned long ago that dignity was not a matter of age but of carriage. Across the room, the Duke of Thornwood stood surrounded by a court of simpering young ladies and their ambitious mothers, Sebastian Devereux. The name alone commanded attention. He was 39, unmarried, possessed of one of the largest fortunes in England, and notoriously indifferent to the marriage market. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched at the temples by distinguished silver, he surveyed the ballroom with the expression of a man who had seen everything and found most of it tiresome. "Your Grace, may I present my daughter, Miss Honoria Featherstone?" a baroness was saying, pushing forward a girl of perhaps 19 whose cheeks bloomed with youth and rouge. The Duke inclined his head. "Miss Featherstone, she plays the pianoforte exquisitely," the baroness continued, "and her watercolors were commended by Sir Thomas Lawrence himself." "How accomplished," the Duke replied, his voice devoid of enthusiasm. Eleanor observed this tableau from her position near the refreshment table, where she had retreated with a glass of ratafia she did not want. She had attended this house party at the insistence of her late husband's cousin, Lady Ashworth, who had declared that Eleanor was far too young to bury herself in the country. "Too young," Eleanor murmured to herself, the corners of her mouth lifting with bitter amusement. The world did not think so. The world thought she had had her season, her marriage, her chance. Now she was meant to step aside and let the next generation take its turn. "You look as though you are calculating the quickest route to escape." The voice came from just behind her shoulder. Low, masculine, unexpectedly warm. Eleanor turned and found herself looking up into the keen gray eyes of the Duke of Thornwood. He had extricated himself from his admirers with the skill of long practice and now stood beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight cleft in his chin, the intelligence that sharpened his features. "Your Grace," she curtsied. "I was merely contemplating the architecture. You—" It was not a question. His gaze traveled over her face with an attention that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "And what is your verdict?" "That the windows are well placed. One could climb through them with minimal difficulty." Duke blinked. Then, to her astonishment, he laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and unguarded, and several heads turned at the sound. "I do not believe we have been introduced," he said, and she realized he was still looking at her, still standing far closer than propriety allowed. "Lady Vane," she supplied. "Eleanor Vane. I am Lady Ashworth's cousin by marriage." "Vane." He repeated her name as though testing its weight. "And have you been hiding in Devonshire long, Lady Vane, or is this a recent retreat from society?" "I have been out of mourning for 2 years now, Your Grace. Society simply has not noticed my return." The words came out more plainly than she intended. She braced herself for the polite retreat, the murmured excuse, the return to younger, brighter things. Instead, the Duke's expression shifted. The polished mask of aristocratic boredom fell away, replaced by something sharper, more intent. "Society," he said quietly, "is a collection of fools who would not recognize genuine substance if it struck them across the face." Before Eleanor could respond, the musicians struck up a waltz and the floor filled with couples. The Duke extended his hand. "Dance with me," was not a request. Eleanor hesitated. "Your Grace, I am not." if you tell me you are not young enough or fashionable enough or whatever foolish objection society has placed in your head, I shall be forced to cause a scene." His gray eyes held hers. "And I am very good at causing scenes." She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and he led her onto the floor. The other dancers parted for them as though by instinct. Alina felt the weight of stairs, heard the whispers beginning to rise like the rustle of leaves before a storm. A widow, dancing with the Duke, the most eligible man in the room. "They say I am too old for love," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The music swelled around them. His hand tightened at her waist. The Duke leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a velvet murmur that sent a tremor through her entire body. "Fine. Girls bore me." Alina's breath caught. The ballroom blurred at the edges. She was aware of nothing but the man holding her, the steel and heat of him, the impossible promise in his words. And beneath the shock, beneath the disbelief, something long buried stirred to life. The Duke smiled as though he knew it. As though he had known it from the moment he saw her standing alone by the refreshment table, calculating her escape. "Not look so startled, Lady Vane," he said. "I have only just begun." The music carried them deeper into the dance, and Alina Vane realized with a thrill of terror and hope that her quiet, respectable life was about to shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. Sebastian de Verle had been bored for approximately 15 years. He had inherited the dukedom at 24, after his father's riding accident, and had spent the intervening years learning to navigate the treacherous waters of the aristocracy with precision and contempt. He had built his fortune through shrewd investments in railways and shipping. He had restored the family estates to a glory they had not known in 3 generations. He had attended countless balls, soirees, and parliamentary sessions, and through it all, he had been suffocatingly, exquisitely bored. Until tonight. Until the woman in amethyst silk with silver in her dark hair and eyes that held the weight of lived experience looked at him as though he were a mild inconvenience rather than a prize to be won. "You are starring, Your Grace," Alina Vane said. They had completed the waltz and retreated to a secluded alcove near the conservatory, where potted palms provided a semblance of privacy. "Am I?" Sebastian made no effort to look away. "How remiss of me." Remissness implies carelessness. "You do not strike me as a careless man." "I am not." He allowed himself to study her properly now, the graceful line of her throat, the slight furrow between her brows that suggested a mind perpetually at work, the way she held herself, straight and still, as though prepared for disappointment. "But you, Lady Vane, strike me as a woman who has learned to expect very little from the world." Alina's expression flickered. "The world has given me precisely what I have earned, Your Grace." "Neither more nor less. What have you earned?" "A son I adore, a comfortable home, the freedom to live as I please within the bounds of respectability." She paused. "And a reputation for being sensible." Sensible. Sebastian tasted the word as though it were vinegar. What a thoroughly dreadful thing to be known for. "It is safe." Safety is overvalued. "Like a man who has never been unsafe." The retort landed between them like a gauntlet thrown. Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond attraction into something far more dangerous. "You are correct," he said slowly. "I have had the luxury of privilege my entire life, but I have also observed that the people who cling most tightly to safety are those who have already survived the worst." Alina's jaw tightened. For a long moment she said nothing, and Sebastian realized he had struck closer to the truth than he had intended. "Husband," she said at last, "was a good man. He gave me my son and he gave me security, and when he died I grieved him sincerely, but I have never known what it means to be loved." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a directness that few dared. "Not in the way the poets describe, not in the way that makes a person feel as though they are the center of someone else's universe." The admission hung in the air between them. Sebastian felt the impact of it like a physical blow. "That," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "is a tragedy far greater than any I have known." Alina's lips parted, but before she could respond, Lady Ashworth descended upon them like a galleon in full sail. "Your Grace, what an honor to find you here." Their hostess beamed, though her eyes darted between them with calculation. "And dear Alina, how charming! I see you have already made the acquaintance of our distinguished guest, Sebastian said, his mask sliding effortlessly back into place. Lady Vane has been enlightening me on the subject of architecture. Lady Ashworth looked bewildered. Architecture? The windows, Elinor supplied, and Sebastian caught the ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. So well placed. I see. Lady Ashworth clearly did not. Well, I must steal the Duke away for a moment. Lord Ashworth wishes to discuss a matter of some importance. Had no choice but to incline his head and follow. But as he passed Elinor, he paused, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. This conversation is not finished, Lady Vane. I shall find you tomorrow. She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat the careful composure slipped, revealing something raw and hopeful beneath. I do not know if that is wise, Your Grace, he said, has never been my strong suit. Fortunately, I have never much cared for it. Left her standing in the alcove, the scent of gardenias drifting from the conservatory, and carried with him the image of her face, caught between longing and fear. That night, Sebastian Devereux lay awake in his guest chamber at Ashworth Hall and stared at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of moonlight that filtered through the curtains. He thought of the parade of debutantes he had endured over the years. Girls barely out of the schoolroom, their conversation limited to fashion and gossip, their eyes holding nothing but the reflection of his title. He had long ago resigned himself to a solitary existence, taking what pleasure he could from his work and his estates. And then Elinor Vane had walked into the room, 37, a widow, a mother, a woman who had lived through loss and disappointment and emerged with her dignity intact and her spirit unbroken. A woman who looked at him and saw a man, not a dukedom. Sebastian closed his eyes and made a decision. He would pursue her. Carefully, deliberately, with all the skill and patience he had learned in his years of navigating the treacherous waters of politics and business. He would breach her defenses, earn her trust, and show her what it meant to be loved in the way the poets described. The world would talk, of course. Society would be scandalized. But Sebastian Devereux had never cared for society's opinion. Let them talk. Let them whisper. Let them say whatever they pleased. He had found something worth fighting for. He was not about to let her slip away. The morning room at Ashworth Hall was flooded with pale October sunlight when Elinor received the first letter. It arrived on a silver salver, carried by a footman who looked distinctly uncomfortable delivering such an intimate item to a lady who was neither young nor particularly important. The paper was heavy cream, the handwriting bold and distinctly masculine. Lady Vane, I find myself unable to concentrate on Lord Ashworth's very tedious discussion of drainage systems when my thoughts persist in wandering to a certain alcove and a conversation left unfinished. I am riding to the village this morning. Accompany me. Thornwood Elinor read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her reticule, her heart beating a rhythm that belonged to a girl of 17 rather than a widow of 37. She should refuse. She knew she should refuse. Every rule of propriety demanded it. Instead, she found herself in the stables at 10 o'clock, accepting the Duke's hand as he assisted her onto a gentle gray mare. You came, he said, and the satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. You gave me very little choice, Your Grace. I gave you every choice. I merely hoped you would make the correct one. They rode through the Devonshire countryside, the hedgerows blazing with autumn color, the air crisp and clean. Sebastian led her along a bridle path that wound through a copse of ancient oaks and emerged onto a hilltop with a view that stretched all the way to the sea. It is beautiful, Elinor breathed. I discovered this place when I was a boy, Sebastian said, dismounting and moving to help her down. His hands lingered at her waist. I came here often, when I needed to escape the expectations of my position. Do you still need to escape? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood beside her at the edge of the hilltop, his profile sharp against the vast sky. More than ever, he said quietly. I am surrounded by people who want something from me. My title, my fortune, my influence. It has been a very long time since someone simply wanted me. Elinor understood then what was happening. This was not flirtation. This was not the idle pursuit of a bored aristocrat. This was a man laying himself bare, offering her a glimpse of the loneliness that lived beneath the polished exterior. "Your Grace, Sebastian." He turned to face her. "When we are alone, I would have you call me by my name. That would be improper. Impropriety is a social construct designed to protect fortunes and reputations. It has nothing to do with what passes between two souls." Alina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You speak as though we have known each other for years rather than a single evening and one morning. Is irrelevant. I have learned more of you in these hours than I have learned of anyone in the past decade." "What have you learned?" He stepped closer. She could smell the clean scent of him, wool and leather and something else, something warm and indefinable. "I have learned that you are brave," he said. "That you have endured loss and emerged stronger. That you love your son with a ferocity that humbles me. That you hide your intelligence behind a mask of propriety because it is safer that way." He paused. "And that you are terrified of what is happening between us because you have never allowed yourself to hope for more than you have." Alina's throat tightened. "You presume a great deal. I observe a great deal. It is not the same thing." She wanted to argue. She wanted to retreat behind the walls she had spent so many years constructing. But the truth of his words held her captive, and the look in his gray eyes left her nowhere to hide. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Everything." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. "I want your laughter and your sorrow, your thoughts and your dreams. I want to know the woman you are when no one is watching. I want to give you what you have never had." "What is that?" "Someone who sees you, truly sees you, and finds you magnificent." Tears came before she could stop them. She had not wept since her husband's funeral, and even then, the tears had been for what might have been rather than what was lost. Now she wept for the years of invisibility, for the loneliness she had never admitted even to herself, for the terrifying, wonderful possibility standing before her in the form of a man who refused to let her hide. Sebastian did not try to comfort her with empty words. He simply drew her into his arms and held her, his chin resting against her hair while the wind swept across the hilltop and the distant sea glittered in the autumn sun. "I am afraid," she said against his chest. "So am I." His arms tightened around her. "I have spent my entire adult life building walls of my own. You are the first person who has ever made me want to tear them down. What are you afraid of?" He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "That I am not capable of being loved for myself, that the title has swallowed the man, that I will spend the rest of my days surrounded by people and die utterly alone." Alina pulled back, looking up into his face. The mask was gone. The polished duke had vanished, leaving only Sebastian, a man with fears and vulnerabilities as real as her own. "You are not alone," she said. "Not anymore." The words were a promise. She did not know if she was ready to keep it. She did not know if the world would allow her to keep it. But standing on that hilltop, with the wind in her hair and his arms around her, Alina Vane made a choice. She would be brave. For the first time in her life, she would reach for something she wanted, consequences be damned. And when Sebastian de Verle lowered his head and kissed her, gentle and reverent, she kissed him back with all the longing of a heart that had waited 37 years to be awakened. The news spread through London like fire through dry bracken. The Duke of Thornwood, that most elusive of bachelors, had been seen riding with a widow. Not just any widow, but Lady Alina Vane, a woman of no particular fortune or connection, a woman who had been invisible to society for half a decade. The whispers began before the ink was dry on the gossip columns. 7 years older than the previous favorite. Quite handsome once, but certainly past her prime. What could his grace possibly see in her? Alina read the papers in the drawing room of her modest London townhouse, her fingers trembling on the newsprint. Beside her, Sebastian paced before the fireplace, his expression murderous. "I will have retractions printed," he said. "I will sue for libel. You will do nothing." Alina folded the paper and set it aside. "This is what happened, Sebastian. You knew it would. I did not anticipate the cruelty. Then you have lived a sheltered life." He stopped packing and looked at her. "Do not make light of this. They are tearing you apart, and it is my doing. It is their doing." Alina rose and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "And I do not care what they say. I did not expect to be happy again in this life. I did not expect to find someone who looked at me the way you do. If the price of that is a few unkind words in the newspapers, I will pay it gladly. You should not have to pay any price at all. Life does not work that way. We both know that. The weeks that followed tested them both. Sebastian's aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Haverford, arrived in London with the express purpose of preventing what she called a catastrophic misalliance. She cornered Eleanor at a musicale and informed her with icy precision that the Duke required a wife who could provide heirs and political connections, not a faded widow with nothing to offer but experience. "I have borne a child, Lady Haverford," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "I am hardly barren." Marchioness's face went white. "You are impertinent." "I am honest. There is a difference." The confrontation became the talk of the town. Some admired Eleanor's courage, most condemned her audacity, and then the letters began arriving, not love letters, threats. The first was delivered by hand, written in a spidery script that made no attempt to disguise its venom. "Leave London, widow. You are not wanted here. The Duke deserves better than used goods. If you persist, you will regret it." Eleanor burned it in the grate and told no one. The second arrived a week later, slipped beneath the door of her townhouse in the dead of night. "Your son is at Cambridge. It would be a shame if something were to happen to him. Do not force our hand." This one she did not burn. She read it 3 times, her blood turning to ice, and then she rang for her carriage and went directly to Thornwood House. Sebastian received her in his study. The moment he saw her face, he crossed the room and took her hands. "What has happened?" She gave him the letter. Without a word, he read it. The color drained from his face, replaced by a fury so cold and absolute that Eleanor took a step back. "This is my aunt's doing," he said, his voice flat. "She has always been ruthless, but this—" he crumpled the letter in his fist. "She has gone too far. You cannot know it was her. I can, and I will deal with it." He looked at her, and the fury in his eyes softened into something else. "But first I must ask you something. Anything." He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, the diamond inside caught the firelight and scattered it into 1,000 points of brilliance. "I had planned a grand gesture," he said. "A ball, a public declaration, something suitably romantic and thoroughly proper." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "But it seems the world is determined to tear us apart before I have the chance. So I will ask you now, without ceremony, without an audience, without anything but the truth of what I feel." He knelt. The Duke of Thornwood, one of the most powerful men in England, knelt before a widow with silver in her hair and a heart full of scars. "Eleanor Vane, I have spent my life searching for something I could not name. The moment I saw you, I knew. You are my home, my harbor, my reason. I will spend the rest of my days protecting you and loving you if you will let me. Will you marry me?" The tears came. They streamed down her face unheeded as she looked at the man kneeling before her. The man who saw her, truly saw her, and found her magnificent. She whispered, "Yes, Sebastian, I will." Rose and drew her into his arms, and the kiss they shared was a promise and a declaration and a defiance of everything the world had tried to tell them about who deserved to be loved. When they parted, he pressed the letter into her hand. "Keep this," he said. "I will need it as evidence." "What are you going to do?" His expression hardened. "I am going to remind my aunt what happens to those who threaten the people I love." He kissed her forehead and strode from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the diamond on her finger and the threatening letter in her hand. She looked down at the ring, watching the light dance across its surface, and allowed herself to believe, for the first time, that happiness might truly be within her reach. But somewhere in the shadows of London, someone was watching. Someone who was not finished with Eleanor Vane. Someone who would stop at nothing to prevent the Duke from marrying a woman they deemed unworthy. The storm was gathering, and Eleanor had no idea how devastating it would be when it broke. The confrontation between the Duke of Thornwood and his aunt became the scandal of the season. Accounts varied wildly. Some said he had publicly accused her in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Others claimed he had paid her a private visit and emerged with a written confession. The truth, as Eleanor knew it, lay somewhere in between. Sebastian had confronted Lady Haverford in her own drawing room, threatened to expose decades of financial irregularities if she did not confess, and emerged 2 hours later with a signed statement and the satisfaction of seeing his aunt depart for the continent within the week. But the damage had been done. The letters had not been Lady Haverford's work, a fact Sebastian discovered with growing unease. She had confessed to her disapproval, to her attempts to dissuade him, even to spreading malicious gossip. But the threats against Eleanor's son had originated elsewhere. Then who? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. They were seated in the library at Thornwood House, the fire casting long shadows across the Persian carpets. Outside, a November rain lashed against the windows. I do not know. Sebastian's jaw was set. But I will find out. He had hired investigators. He had called in favors from magistrates and Bow Street runners. For 2 weeks, they had lived in a state of suspended tension. Eleanor's son brought home from Cambridge under the protection of the Duke's own household. And then the truth emerged, not from the investigators, but from a source Eleanor had never expected. Lady Margaret Haversham was the daughter of an earl, 23 years old, and widely considered the most eligible young lady of the season before Sebastian's attentions had turned elsewhere. She had been among the debutantes at Ashworth Hall that first evening, watching from across the ballroom as the Duke approached the widow in amethyst silk. She had not forgotten. She believed she was destined to become the Duchess of Thornwood, Sebastian said, reading from the investigator's report. His voice was hollow with disbelief. She had planned it for years, cultivated the connection, positioned herself, and when I showed no interest, she blamed you. Eleanor listened in growing horror as the full scope of Lady Margaret's machinations unfolded. The threatening letters, the bribes to servants for information, the whispered campaign of character assassination that had turned half of London against Eleanor before she had even set foot in the city. She is a girl, Eleanor said, barely out of the schoolroom. How could she? She is old enough to know right from wrong. Sebastian's voice was merciless. She threatened your son. She tried to destroy your reputation. She will answer for it. Scandal broke in the papers the following morning. Lady Margaret's family, desperate to avoid prosecution, agreed to a permanent exile to their Scottish estate. The young lady herself was never seen in London again, but the damage to Eleanor ran deeper than reputation. They will always hate me, she said, standing at the window of Sebastian's study and watching the rain fall. The young ladies and their mothers, the aristocrats who believe I have stolen something that belonged to them. Even if we marry, I will always be the widow who dared to reach above her station, came to stand behind her, his reflection joining hers in the rain-streaked glass. Them hate you, he said. Their hatred says more about them than it ever will about you. It will affect you as well, your political influence, your standing. I do not care about my standing. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I care about you. I care about the life we will build together. Everything else is noise. Eleanor looked up at him, this man who had been a stranger only weeks ago and had somehow become the center of her world. I am not afraid of their hatred, she said slowly. I am afraid that one day you will wake up and realize that you could have had a young bride, a woman who could give you children, a wife who did not come with scars and history, and a son who is nearly a man himself. I do not want a young bride. His voice was fierce. I do not want children unless they are yours. I do not want a blank canvas unmarked by life. I want you, every scar, every year, every silver hair. You speak as though my age is a virtue. It is. He cupped her face in his hands. Every year you have lived has made you the woman you are, the woman I love. I would not trade a single one of them. She kissed him then with a passion that surprised them both. The rain continued to fall, the fire continued to crackle, and somewhere in the depths of Thornwood House, the future stretched out before them, full of promise and peril in equal measure. When they finally drew apart, Sebastian smiled. The bans have been read, he said. The license has been obtained. In 3 weeks you will be the Duchess of Thornwood. Are you prepared? Eleanor thought of the whispers, the threats, the scandal. She thought of her son, who had come to admire Sebastian with a fervor that warmed her heart. She thought of the quiet country widow she had been and the woman she was becoming. I am prepared, she said, for all of it. There was one more trial to come, one more test of their love and their resolve, and it was waiting for them on the steps of St. George's Church on the morning of their wedding day. The morning of December the 14th dawned cold and crystalline, the sky above Hanover Square a pale, washed blue. St. George's Church had been decorated with hothouse roses and trailing ivy, the pews filled with the curious, the skeptical, and the few genuine well-wishers who had supported the match from the beginning. Alina stood in the vestibule, her hand resting on her son's arm. James Vane was 18 now, tall and serious, with his father's steady gaze and his mother's quiet strength. "You are certain about this?" he asked, his voice low. "You do not have to go through with it. I can create a diversion." Despite her nerves, Alina laughed. "And what manner of diversion would that be?" "I could set something on fire, nothing too important." "Appreciate the offer, but I believe I shall proceed." She squeezed his arm. "I love him, James. I did not think I would ever feel this way again. I did not think I was capable of it." Looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I shall be proud to give you away." The organ began to play. The congregation rose, and Alina Vane, 37 years old, a widow of 6 years, a mother of 1, began her slow procession toward the altar. Sebastian was waiting for her. He stood tall and commanding in his dark wedding coat, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the church fall away. The silver at his temples caught the candlelight. The expression on his face was one of naked, undisguised joy. The ceremony began. The bishop's voice rolled through the ancient words. The congregation sat and sat again. And then came the moment that would be remembered in London drawing rooms for years afterward. The bishop reached the traditional words. "If any of you can show just cause why these two persons may not be joined together in holy matrimony, speak now, or else hereafter and forever hold your peace." Silence. The bishop drew breath to continue, and the doors of the church crashed open. A man stood silhouetted against the winter light, tall, expensively dressed. His face was flushed with cold and fury. "I object." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Alina felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Sebastian went rigid. "On what grounds?" the bishop demanded, his voice sharp with disapproval. The man strode down the aisle, his boots ringing against the stone floor. As he drew closer, Alina saw his face clearly for the first time, and recognition struck her like a physical blow. Lord Henry Ashby, she breathed, the brother of her late husband. A man she had not seen in 7 years. A man who had contested the will, tried to seize the estate, and vanished from society when the courts ruled against him. "That woman," Ashby declared, pointing at Alina with a trembling finger, "is unfit to be a duchess. She is a fraud, a deceiver, and I have the proof." He brandished a sheaf of papers. The congregation erupted in whispers. Sebastian stepped forward, positioning himself between Alina and her accuser. His voice was ice. "You have 30 seconds to explain yourself before I have you removed." "These are letters," Ashby announced, turning to address the congregation as though he were an actor on a stage. "Letters written by Lady Vane to a man who was not her husband. Love letters, written during her marriage, proof that she is an adulteress." Word hung in the air like poison. Alina could not breathe. The letters she had never written. The letters that were forgeries manufactured by a man who had spent 7 years nursing his hatred. "They are false," she said, but her voice was barely a whisper. Ashby laughed. "I have had them examined by experts. The handwriting is yours. The dates correspond to the final months of my brother's life. You betrayed him while he lay dying." Whispers grew louder. Alina saw faces she recognized, faces that had pretended friendship, now twisting with vindication and disgust, and then Sebastian spoke. "You are a liar," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "And you are a fool." Ashby's triumphant expression faltered. "Your Grace, I understand your loyalty, but the evidence is a fabrication." Sebastian took the papers from Ashby's hand and held them up. "I know these letters. I know them because I have been investigating you for the past month, Lord Ashby. I know about your debts. I know about your desperation. I know that you approached a forger in Cheapside 3 weeks ago and paid him £200 to create these documents." Ashby's face went gray. "You see," Sebastian continued, his voice dropping to a silken menace, "when I learned of the threats against my betrothed, I did not stop with Lady Margaret. I investigated every enemy she had, including you. I have the forger's sworn testimony. I have the bank records. I have everything I need to see you transported for fraud and defamation." He stepped closer to Ashby, and the other man shrank back. "Leave this church. Leave London. If I ever see your face again, I will destroy you with the full force of my power and my fortune. Do you understand?" Ashby fled. The doors slammed behind him. The church was silent, and then Alina began to laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of pure, overwhelming relief, the release of tension so profound that her knees buckled. Sebastian caught her, his arms strong around her. "You knew," she said, looking up at him. "You knew he would come." "I suspected." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I made certain I was prepared. You could have told me. I did not want you to worry, Sebastian Devereux." She shook her head, still half laughing, half crying. "You are the most infuriating man I have ever met. You are about to marry me regardless." He turned to the bishop, who was staring at them with an expression of profound bewilderment. "Your Grace, I believe there are no further objections. Shall we continue?" The ceremony resumed. The vows were exchanged. The ring was placed upon her finger, and when the bishop pronounced them man and wife, the congregation erupted in applause that was part relief, part admiration, and part sheer astonishment at the drama they had witnessed. Sebastian kissed his bride, and it was not a chaste, ceremonial kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of passion and promise and a future that no one could take from them. As they walked down the aisle together, Alina looked up at her husband. "What happens now?" she asked. Sebastian smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had finally found what he had been searching for all his life. "Now," he said, "we begin." 5 years later, the Duchess of Thornwood stood at the window of the great library at Devereux Hall and watched her sons playing on the lawn, 3 of them. James, her firstborn, now a confident young man of 23 who had taken to managing the estate with a skill that made his stepfather proud. And the twins, William and Thomas, dark-haired and gray-eyed like their father, tumbling across the grass in a mock cavalry charge with wooden swords. "You are thinking again." Sebastian's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. She leaned back against him, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "I am always thinking," she said. "It is a terrible habit. What about this time?" She was silent for a moment, watching the twins. William had just tripped over a tree root and was being helped up by his brother with the solemn dignity of a 4-year-old. "About the day we met," she said. "At Ashworth Hall. I almost did not attend that house party. I had convinced myself that my life was settled, that I was content with solitude and routine. If I had stayed home, you would have saved yourself a great deal of trouble." His voice was teasing, but beneath it ran a current of something deeper. Scandal, threats, confrontations at the altar. "I would have missed this." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face. The silver at his temples had spread, threading through his dark hair. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He was, she thought, more handsome now than he had ever been. "I would have missed you, the children, everything. Then I'm eternally grateful that you decided to brave the Devonshire autumn." He kissed her forehead. "Though I maintain that I would have found you eventually, I am a very determined man." "So I have observed." They stood together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had built a life on the foundation of a single, improbable moment. Outside, the twins had abandoned their sword fight and were now attempting to climb a very patient Labrador retriever. James was striding across the lawn toward them, his voice carrying on the breeze as he called out instructions. The years had not been without their challenges. Society had taken time to accept their union, and there were still drawing rooms where Alina's name was spoken with a curl of the lip. But Sebastian had been unwavering in his defense of her, and gradually the tide had turned. The Duchess of Thornwood became known for her grace, her intelligence, and her quiet determination to use her position for good. She established a charity for widows, providing education and employment for women who, like her, had been left to navigate the world alone. She became a patron of the arts, a voice in Parliament through her husband, and a beloved figure among the tenants of the Devereux estates. The widow who had been invisible had become one of the most respected women in England. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Alina asked. "That first night, when I told you society thought I was too old for love." "I remember." His voice was soft. "I told you that girls bored me." "You did, and I thought you were either mad or mocking me." "I was neither." He cupped her face in his hands, the same gesture he had made 100 times before, and yet it still made her heart catch. I had spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted the Duke, not the man. You were the first person who looked at me and saw Sebastian. You challenged me. You made me laugh. You made me feel. You made me feel as well. She covered his hands with her own. You made me feel young again, not in years but in spirit. As though the world was still full of possibility. It is. He kissed her, soft and lingering. It always will be as long as we are together. A crash from the lawn interrupted them. Thomas had succeeded in climbing the Labrador, who had responded by rolling over with an expression of canine bewilderment. William was shrieking with laughter. James was attempting to restore order and failing utterly. "We should rescue the dog," Elinor said. A moment. Sebastian did not release her. "I want to tell you something first." She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "I spent 39 years searching for something I could not name," he said. "I thought it was purpose, achievement, legacy. But it was none of those things. It was you. It was always you. And every morning I wake up beside you, I am grateful that you were brave enough to come to that house party, and that I was wise enough to notice the woman in amethyst silk who was calculating her escape route through the windows." Elinor laughed, remembering. The windows were well placed. They were. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had everything he had ever wanted. "But you did not climb through them. You stayed. And in staying, you gave me the greatest gift I have ever received." "What is that?" "A heart that is no longer bored." He kissed her again. "A life that is no longer lonely. A love that grows deeper with every passing year." Elinor's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy, the same tears she had shed on their wedding day, the same tears she shed every time he looked at her like this, as though she were the center of his universe. "I love you, Sebastian de Verl," she said, "and I love you, Elinor de Verl." He offered her his arm. "Now shall we go rescue the Labrador? I believe Thomas is attempting to ride him like a cavalry charger." They walked out into the golden afternoon, arm in arm, the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood. Behind them, the great house stood proud against the Devon sky. Before them, their sons played on the lawn, their laughter ringing like bells in the clear autumn air. And somewhere in London, in the drawing rooms and ballrooms where the gossip still occasionally surfaced, the story was told of the widow who had been too old for love, and the Duke who had whispered that girls bored him. It was a story of scandal and defiance, of threats and redemption, of two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. But most of all, it was a story of love. The kind of love that did not care about age or expectation or the whispers of a world that had forgotten how to recognize the real thing. The kind of love that lasted. And as Elinor walked beside her husband, her hand in his, her heart full, she knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. Not safety. Not respectability. Not the quiet, invisible existence of a widow who had accepted her lot. She had found home. And home, she had learned, was not a place. It was a person. A person who saw her, truly saw her, and found her magnificent. The Duchess of Thornwood smiled, and the autumn sun caught the silver in her hair, and the Duke looked at her with eyes that held no boredom at all. Only love. Only ever love.